What is up, everybody, and welcome to my early review of one of the more hotly anticipated movies of the year, and what was one of the most hotly anticipated movies of last year, Dune Part 2. So back in 2021, Denis Villeneuve released his version of Dune, which is based off of a series of novels. There was also an adaptation, a film adaptation of this back in the 80s, directed by David Lynch, which I have not seen, called Dune, and it was just the first half of the first book. And I was one of those people that I won't say it was skeptical, but I wasn't on the massive hype train for Dune upon its release. Denis Villeneuve, while being a fantastic filmmaker, a lot of his movies are movies I appreciate more than I actually enjoy, and being that I had no knowledge, no experience with the source material, and the trailers were very much just focusing on the visuals and the world building, similar to how they did in Blade Runner 2049, I walked into that not really knowing if Dune was going to be for me or not. And I absolutely loved the first Dune. It was one of my favorite movies that year. It is still currently my favorite film by Denis Villeneuve. And while I was initially very nervous and scared walking out of the theater, because at the time of release, we did not have a green light for a Dune Part 2. So it was really very much kind of hanging in the balance whether or not we're actually going to experience the rest of this story or not. Luckily, not too long, maybe 2 weeks after the release of that film, they announced Dune Part 2. Fast forward to now, and it's finally upon us. Now, I'm going to say this right off the bat. I'm going to keep this review spoiler free, as I always do my best to, but if you are somebody that does not want to know anything about this film, being that I'm talking about it more than a week before all of you are going to be able to see this publicly, please do not watch this video. I cannot stand having comments in the comment section saying, I didn't want to know this, I didn't want to know that, I didn't want to know this character's name. Don't watch reviews then. Now, there have been some screenings previous to now. There's been the world premiere and a few other places earlier on this week throughout the country where we've been able to see numerous early reactions online. And not only have they been pretty much universally praiseworthy, but they're using language to give you the impression that this movie is possibly the greatest cinematic achievement that has ever been able to grace a theater. And whenever that happens, I always walk in a bit skeptical. I'm like, okay, is this really the greatest thing ever, or is this just the greatest thing since the last greatest thing ever, which was probably last week that you fuckers were hyping up?
That is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I tell ye what.
So I drove 4 hours to Atlanta, Georgia last night to check this thing out, and then drove 4 hours home, was very excited for this, and I'm here to tell you, this is a very good movie. It is a good follow-up to the first film. It continues most of the things that we really enjoyed about the first film, does some of them better, some of them not so much, in my opinion. Do I think this is the greatest cinematic masterpiece of all time? Do I think that this would have just ran through every single movie that came out in 2023 if this did get released last year? Personally, no. But I don't think this movie has to be that. I don't think that this has to be the greatest cinematic achievement. I don't think that this has to best everything that happened in the first film. I don't think that this has to make a benchmark that cinema will now be measured against, and movie making was one way, and then Dune Part 2 happened, and now movie making is another. I don't think that this has to be that. So while talking about the film, I'm also briefly going to discuss that. Starting off with the positives for Dune Part 2, just like the first film, I think this one is absolutely a technical achievement. Everything from the cinematography, to the score, to the sound design, the costume design, the set design, the color palette choices, everything on a visual front and an audio front in this movie is masterfully done, to the point where I do agree with the point that everybody that is up for Oscars for this year better be thankful that Dune Part 2 moved to 2024, or it'd be sweeping quite a few of those categories. I think this is a beautifully shot movie. I love the way that this has one of those really interesting mixes of bringing you into this very futuristic world while having this aesthetic of something archaic. Like, it's very sand driven, obviously. There's a lot of tans, there's a lot of this barren wasteland look to it, while also having this technological marvel with some of the ships, with a lot of the technology that they use, with even just kind of the performances in and of themselves feel like this advanced society in a lot of ways. It's a really interesting mix, and it's all brought together by really interesting costume design for the Freeman characters to even the people that are hanging out with the Emperor and all of the villains here. Everybody's got their own look and their own way that they're shot. There's a whole sequence that's a fight sequence underneath this glowing moon Dune that's entirely in black and white and brings a really cool visual change in the movie that I was a little bit confused when I saw in the trailer of why it was black and white. When you see it in the context of the film, it was actually really interesting. So as somebody that is fascinated with the filmmaking process, all of that in Dune Part 2 is something that I would be fascinated to see how that all came together. It's something I would love to watch a documentary on, or behind the scenes, or just even read a book if Denis Villeneuve was to release that, the making of Dune. The way that they brought all of those things together to create this world now twice is an absolute achievement. And I especially want to talk about the sound design here, because I saw it in a big badass theater. You know, I'm not really somebody who has gone to too many press screenings, but I've been to a few, and they tend to just put you in regular theaters. The studio clearly wanted this movie to be seen on the best screen with the best sound system that was available in the area. And so it was an AMC theater. It was the very first one that felt like its own theater within the theater. And I'm telling you, during certain sequences of this movie, like whenever they have the sandworms coming, or they have the thundering roar of battles that are getting ready to kick off, I'm sitting here watching Dune and my seat is vibrating and shaking like I'm about to go off the cliff on a roller coaster. And every single sequence in this movie where they want to just absolutely capture your imagination, as wonderful as the visuals are, the sound achieved that for me. As far as performances, everybody that did a great job in the first film that returns for this movie also does a great job, but I specifically want to point out a few of them. Timothée Chalamet as your lead here as Paul. It was interesting to see his character change and grow and even devolve in certain ways from who he was in the first film, because not only is it kind of bringing new flavors to that character, but also bringing new flavors to what we've seen Timothée Chalamet do. You know, he's done a lot of roles that are a little bit more whimsical and focus a little bit more on maybe like teen romance and things like that, with a few exceptions here and there, like Bones and all. But in the first film, he's very much that young, naive, possible prophet. You're somebody that has this world he doesn't completely understand, but is trying to find where he fits in it. And in the second film, he very much has to rise to that occasion. This story is very much about his rise to power and his fulfillment in certain ways of this prophecy that he does not fully believe in. And there were certain sequences and certain shades to his performance that I think was really interesting to see him grow that out, and to see the more ferocious side of this character, and to see the leader that everybody sees in him or doubts in him, and him having to prove them wrong. So I think that as a performer, especially if you've seen a lot of his previous work, it was interesting to see what he brought differently to this second part of Paul's story. I also thought Zendaya was really interesting. Now, she's a character that we only saw pretty much in premonitions and in the very tail end of the film in the first one. Here, she is very much a full-fledged character. She's, I would say, second bill to Timothée Chalamet, but it's such a massive cast with a massive scope that everybody pretty much shares the screen time in this one. But she's very much a prominent character that is a romance, a love interest for Timothée Chalamet's Paul, while also being the person that challenges him the most, and the person that is kind of guiding him in his learning of the Freeman ways. And I think that as a performer, she did some really interesting things, because she really commands the screen whenever she is trying to give a lot of pushback to the prophecy of what Paul is supposed to be. Whether she's talking to Javier Bardem, or she's talking to Rebecca Ferguson, or she's facing Paul herself, she is one of the tougher characters on screen, and I think she brought that forward very well. And even, I'm not going to get specific with what happens, but even in scenes where her love is tested and she has to deal with heartbreak or deal with betrayal in certain ways, the camera just focuses on her face. She doesn't even have dialogue during these scenes, and you get everything out of her eyes. You don't need dialogue to convey what's going on with that character. And finally, I want to praise Javier Bardem, another character who was just in the tail end of the first film and in one scene earlier on, but is very much promoted in this second part of this story. And what I liked so much about him was the very subtle but hilarious comedy that he brought. He is the character that believes most strongly in the prophecy and what was written for Paul to eventually rise to, and the level of dedication that his character has to this prophecy is very much intended humor sometimes in situations that are very serious and there's nothing funny going on, but his response to it, or the dialogue and the way that Javier Bardem delivers it, gets a really nice reaction out of the crowd. And so I really appreciated what his character and his performance brought to the movie of bringing in some lightness that was very much needed to break up such a dense story. You get a lot more action in this movie. I would hesitate to call this an action-packed sequel, and I do want to temper your expectations because I've seen a lot of people going way overboard with the action, either describing the scale or the choreography, saying like this is the greatest hand-to-hand combat we've ever seen, and these are the best war sequences that we've seen since Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings. Like, not quite. But again, they don't have to be. I think that there's a nice variety of action here. There is gunplay and explosions. There is hand-to-hand combat. There is things going on with riding these sandworms and weaponizing them in certain ways. So they're pretty much relegated to the first act and the third act. There's not a ton of action in the middle, but when you do get it, it's very exciting. And finally, I do think that Dune Part 2 does a pretty good job at paying off most of what you need to be paid off in the second chapter that was built up and was introduced in the first film. The first film was very much focused on world building and introducing you to these characters, introducing you to the politics and the different houses and the monetization and the politics surrounding the spice and all of that. There was so much to explain in that first film that they did a really good job of just setting up the world. And here you needed to pay a lot of that off. And I think that most of what they achieved as far as payoff is very satisfying, whether it be character arcs, whether it be action sequences or revenge or characters coming face to face again after the events of the first film. The moments that are meant to pay off the events that we were set up in the first film are mostly satisfying. Now moving on to the mixed, and the biggest thing that I am very torn and conflicted on in regards to this second film, and again, if you don't want to know anything about this movie, please click off. This does not feel like the second half of a story. This feels like the middle third of a story. Now, there's multiple Dune books. As I said at the beginning, I have not read any of them. I have not seen the movie from the 80s, and I have since looked into it, and this movie is the second half of the first book. So if you just wanted the first book's adaptation, this is a part 1, part 2 scenario. But by the end of this film, the things that are paid off versus the things that are left dangling, I don't feel enough was paid off and enough was concluded for me to be completely satisfied with this feeling like the second half of a story, and hopefully we get to see more. This very much feels like part 2 of at least 3 movies, and it has that middle chapter syndrome that some of those films that are in that placement has. Very rarely do you get a movie that is a part of a trilogy or more that is able to completely stand on its own and be its own isolated, satisfying experience. One of the more classic examples is the original Star Wars trilogy. I can throw on Empire Strikes Back without feeling like I needed to watch A New Hope or follow it up with Return of the Jedi. I can have a fully holistic, satisfying experience watching that middle chapter. I don't think I'll ever be able to have that with Dune Part 2. As masterful as these movies are in many ways, and whenever we get to the end of this franchise, however many films that is, it could end up being one of the best and most acclaimed film franchises of all time. And I will never find myself sitting around going, you know, I'm in the mood to just watch Dune Part 2. I'm just going to throw that one on. It's a movie experience that to me only will make sense if you're watching through the entire franchise. There's so many things that happen in that first film that this just immediately picks up on, that it's not really a jarring start because I've experienced the first film, but it doesn't start in a way where you feel like you're experiencing this new story. It's literally the second part. And the way that it ends was not fully satisfying to where I can just stop there. I need to know what happens next. And that's kind of a good thing. I mean, I'm saying I want more, but let's compare it to like a season of television. You watch an isolated season of television, you should feel like during that 10 to 12 hour story that yes, you're in the middle of the grander scheme of a story, but you've experienced something that feels complete. in and of itself within that season. There's threads that still need to be paid off. There's things that certainly benefit you to know from the first season, but you should be able to watch that and feel whole by the end of it. I didn't really feel whole by the end of Dune Part 2. And I don't know if it's because I walked in expecting this to be the second half of a two-part story and didn't find out until the credits rolled that, oh no, there's very much a lot more that still needs to happen. There's at least one or two more movies to come. I don't know if knowing that walking in would have changed that expectation and made me experience the story a little differently and feel a little more satisfied and whole with it. That's part of the reason why I'm bringing it up in this review. I think that many people, knowing that this is not the end and don't expect it to be a completed story, will actually help your experience. But I'd be lying if I said that this feels like a complete experience to me. This very much feels like middle chapter syndrome. And that would be easier for me to accept if I knew that a chapter 3, I believe they're calling it Dune Messiah, was coming soon, or was even coming at all. All that we have to go off of right now is Denis Villeneuve in an interview saying that he wants to do a Dune Messiah, which is the title of the second book, and presumably he would just make that whole book one movie. And he said that if he does do it, that's going to be his last Dune movie. So I'm reading that as, yes, there is going to be a third and final chapter, probably, but it's not finished being written yet. It's not officially greenlit by the studio yet. And he's also said that it's pretty likely he's going to go off and do some other things before he comes back and does Dune Messiah. So how long we're going to have to wait to have this story concluded, I have no idea. I can tell you that the wait from 2021 to now felt like an eternity, and it's probably going to be a longer one before we get to Dune Messiah. And so yeah, it's a conflicted feeling. When we get the whole picture, I'm sure I'll feel better about it. That's why I stuck this in the mixed. As of right now, as somebody who waited a long time for this movie and was hotly anticipating this movie and was so ready to have all the conclusions and the answers, and I only got some of them, I'm very conflicted with that. Now moving on to the negatives, and the smallest negative that I can give you, one that didn't affect a ton of my experience, was I didn't completely buy into the romance angle between Timothée Chalamet's Paul and Zendaya's Chani. I feel like maybe that could have been developed out a little bit further. All we saw to develop that out in the first film was a lot of premonitions, and of course you got the impression that they were eventually going to hook up. They were eventually going to have some kind of a love angle in there, so it didn't come out of nowhere. But in this movie, it really felt like that was suddenly kind of dove into. They just instantly had this connection, and I didn't completely feel like that was built out enough to buy it. With as conflicted of a character as Chani is in regards to Timothée Chalamet's character and her doubts equally matching her infatuation with him, I just feel like I needed a little bit more to buy how strong they want you to believe this love connection is between these two characters. And my next two negatives are gonna sound like they're conflicting ideas, and they maybe sound a little bit hypocritical, I guess, in concept, but I'm gonna do my best to try to explain why they're not. So this movie very much to me has a middle hour lull. I've seen a lot of people say the pacing of this movie is immaculate and it's so much better than the first film. I completely disagree. I felt the first film was much better paced. There was no point in that first film that I was bored or that I was starting to slow down with my intrigue or excitement. And this film very much had a big section in the middle. After it kicks off with a lot of action sequences and Timothée Chalamet joining in the Freeman and taking on these spice harvesters. And before you get to all the third act stuff where he's taking the fight to the Emperor, there is a big middle section where they kind of go off and introduce you to the Emperor, and they introduce you to Florence Pugh's character, the Princess, and then they introduce you to Austin Butler's villain and inform you about what's going on with them and the power shifts going on within that house. And there's a lot of stuff in between the very action-packed first act and action-packed third act that is important, it's interesting, but the pacing goes down so slow for such a long part of the movie that I feel like they needed to interject a little bit of excitement in there to break some of that up, because as invested as I was in this movie, it did make a 2 hour and 40-minute film feel like it was about 3 hours and 20 minutes. Like, I saw this with Film Stocked, and Chris, before the movie even started, he was like, yeah, movie's 2 hours and 45 minutes. And we were like, oh, okay, cool. And there was a point about maybe halfway through the film that I actually had the thought of, yeah, Chris must have read something wrong, because we're at least 2 hours and 45 minutes in by this point, and we got a long way to go. And I'll be damned, the credits rolled, I looked at my phone, oh shit, Chris, you were right, that felt way longer than that. But with that being said, with that middle hour lull and the pacing being dragged down a good bit for my own personal taste, I also feel like this is one of those movies where I would want to see an extended cut, and I would want to see a lot more time spent with certain elements of this movie and see a longer version of it. Because there is so much to explore. This is such a dense world with dense lore and multiple characters and multiple character motivations and all these intertwining threads that even though we explored so much within this film and even these two films, I still feel a bit at arm's length with a lot of it. There's a lot of things going on with Rebecca Ferguson's character and how she advances into being like this, prophetic clairvoyance at one point that I kind of feel like I need to know more about what's going on with that. There's certain things with Paul's prophecy that feel like we're just kind of told the same details over and over that I felt could be built out more. I've already talked about his relationship with Zendaya that could be built out a bit more. Even the villainous side of things. You got Skarsgård's character from the first film that was very imposing that I felt like we didn't get near enough of in this one. Same thing with Batista's character, who seems like this rabid bulldog, and he doesn't necessarily fulfill that in a kind of a comedic way in here that I wanted to see more about what's going on with that character. And the introduction of Austin Butler's villain, who is supposed to be kind of one of the more sociopathic tour de force villains in the Dune world, I didn't feel like I got to know enough about that character. So there was so much in this movie that I wanted to see more of, I wanted to have explored more, that when the credits rolled, while having so many things that are dangling plot threads that I want to have answered as soon as possible, there was even some things that were paid off where I'm like, I could have spent more time with that. I don't know if I'm feeling completely satisfied with even some of those things. Now, one thing I want to talk about briefly before I wrap this up is kind of in relation to early reactions and hype and massive hyperbole in regards to said reactions. This is one of those movies that I've seen just a lot of those big, gigantic words. Masterpiece, masterful, riveting, life-changing. I've been on record numerous times about how I really hate how empty a lot of those early reactions seem, especially when you see the same people using those same verbiage and the same language for every single movie that they're able to see early. Now, this might be one of those movies that most people would say merits those types of reactions. Obviously, if you've listened to this entire review, I don't think that it necessarily merits a lot of those words, at least in my own personal experience. But more importantly, what I want to hammer home is that you should never walk into a movie with this bar of it has to be the greatest thing ever, otherwise it's a disappointment, or otherwise it sucks, or otherwise something was wrong, or something was done wrong. Like, there's so many things about this movie that is worthy of praise, that is worthy of acclaim, that I appreciate, that I'm glad, even spending 8 hours on the fucking road to go and see it, I feel satisfied for. There's certain things that weren't. And that's fine. I never walked into Dune 2 with the expectation of this has to blow my balls off. This has to be the greatest thing that I have seen over the last number of years. Otherwise, what's the point? And, that's just one of those things in modern movie discussion, especially online, that I think is an issue. So if you're walking into Dune Part 2, if you're excited, if you love Dune Part 1, just walk into it expecting to have a good story and to spend almost 3 hours in the theater letting a masterful filmmaker tell you a very interesting and dense and lore-ridden story. Don't walk into it expecting your life to be changed, because if you walk in with those expectations, you're almost always going to be disappointed. So all in all, guys, I did enjoy this movie. I personally enjoyed the first film more. And until I get the complete picture of what this whole Dune story is going to be by the end, I won't be able to reevaluate that. But there's so many things about this I thought were great. I just felt the story was a bit ill-paced in spots, and I was not well prepared to have this be a middle chapter. I very much was bought in on this being the second half and the conclusion of this story. and I can't tell you whether that would have changed my review if I knew that or not, because history has already happened. But if you enjoyed the first one, I can almost guarantee you'll enjoy this second one. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all my 2024 new release reviews. I'm also going to put my review of the first Dune up here for you to check out. Please like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.